My name is Rimas Uzgiris. I'm going to speak English for this interview because I translate for Vilnius Review, and our whole goal is to present Lithuanian literature to the English-speaking world. And I can also be more articulate in English because although I am a Lithuanian citizen, I was born and raised and educated in the United States. My parents were born in Lithuania. My children were born in Lithuania. My wife was born in Lithuania. So I, however, was not, and all my education is in English. So that is why I am more articulate in English, and that's why I translate Lithuanian literature into English. And I also write poetry in English. And likewise, my value, I consider one of my chief values to my students at the university, at Vilnius University, to be the fact that I am a native speaker, and we don't have that many native English speakers in the philology faculty. So I talk to them in English all the time as well. So I'm living in Lithuania as a Lithuanian citizen, but am an English speaker primarily. And I have this sort of strange life where I'm both speaking in Lithuanian and English, but English has primacy for me, and I can't quite get away from that. Lithuanian was my first language as a baby, right? It was the language my parents spoke to me first, and the language I first started to learn. However, when I first went to, I think they called it nursery school, I needed to speak English. Everyone else spoke English, and I still have vague memories of being a toddler and struggling to fit in. And so from a very early age, I felt myself a bit marked as different. I had this foreign language and this foreign name, and yet here I was in upstate New York, needing to learn English and going to English school with English speakers. Being in upstate New York, there was no Lithuanian community nearby. So unlike other Lithuanian Americans, I never went to the Saturday school. I never had that tradition where in Chicago and New York and Boston, they would have Saturday school where they would study Lithuanian language and history and culture. I was a little bit cut off from that because we were rather far away. It would take 3 hours to drive to Boston or New York from where we lived. And so I only had my Lithuanian through my parents and grandparents. And then when I got a little bit older, I would go to summer camps in Vermont. And it was called Neringa. It still is called Neringa. It's still a working summer camp for Lithuanians in America. And there we would take Lithuanian language and culture and history classes, although the children all spoke English to each other. But all the instructors and the camp counselors would speak Lithuanian. So my Lithuanian was limited in that sense. I never achieved a sophisticated level, and it wasn't till later when I actually traveled to Lithuania that I started to cultivate my Lithuanian language to try to get it to a higher level of articulation and understanding. In all of my relations with Lithuania, I only visited Vilnius. I lived, as I said, in Kaunas for a year, and my first wife was from Prienai, and so Prienai and Kaunas were still more the places we went to when we came back. However, when I got the Fulbright Scholarship Award, I came to Vilnius University, and I had been for 2 weeks in Vilnius for a summer literary seminars writing program before the Fulbright, and I had felt a certain magic to the new Vilnius, and I very much wanted to be there. And so the Fulbright brought me to Vilnius. to Vilnius University, and I think I was quite mesmerized by the city. I found it beautiful and fascinating. I had read Tomas Venclova's Guide to Vilnius, and I enjoyed wandering the old town streets. It was full of so many historical references, historical tragedies as well. I just felt that the whole city was speaking history to me, and it also had all kinds of little hidden gems and courtyards and passageways that made it mysterious and fascinating. I continued with my fascination with Vilnius for the almost 12 years I've been here now, living in Vilnius. And I even lead literary tours in English of Vilnius, where I walk around to places that writers have written about, or where writers lived who wrote about Vilnius. And I read English translations, and one of my focuses is on the multilingual, multi-ethnic past of Vilnius. So I enjoy exploring the Polish and the Yiddish Vilnius, as well as the Lithuanian-speaking Vilnius. I find Vilnius as this multicultural, multilingual capital a really fascinating place. And I like literature that explores those elements of it. As a reader, I feel obligated in many directions. And one is I, of course, have to keep reading American and British and Irish literature because English is my lifeblood, so to speak. I write in it and I translate into it. And I also teach some English literature, 20th century poetry, in fact. I always need to keep reading more widely and deeply in the English literary tradition. And then there's, of course, Lithuania, because I'm a translator from Lithuanian, and I often am called upon to represent Lithuanian literature to the English-speaking world. So I try to keep up with Lithuanian literature. Sometimes I, of course, read because we're planning to translate a certain poet or a certain author, and so I read their work. But I also teach, for instance, a course on translating contemporary Lithuanian literature into English to translation students. And in that course, I always change things. I always pick different contemporary novels, usually. My students want to read novels more than poetry. I don't know if I have a very systematic way of choosing, but I try to start with certain classic works of the 90s, if we can call them classic. That is, works that deal with the trauma of the Soviet experience. And here I'm thinking of Tula by Jurgis Kunčinas or Vilnius Poker by Ričardas Gavelis. And moving on into towards the 21st century, or just into it, with Sigitas Parulskis's 3 Seconds of Heaven, 3 Sekundės Dangaus. I could also add, we just read the Ragan ir Lietus by Jurga Ivanauskaitė, that is The Witch and the Rain. And a lot of these works deal with characters who are deeply traumatized by their experiences of the Soviet Union. In some cases, they were outsiders who were resisting the Soviet Union and living a kind of bohemian life or a life on the margins, sometimes related to alcohol abuse. In other times, they simply bear quite a lot of scars and they're trying in ways that aren't very healthy, you could say, to deal with that experience. And I find this to be an important way to understand how Lithuania as a nation was developing and throwing off the shackles of the colonial experience and trying to digest what happened to it, so to speak, to see what scars were left on us and how do we move forward from here. And then in the 21st century, we find quite a lot of moving forward. And what I really enjoy about a lot of recent literature is its ability to not obsess about the traumas of the past, and its ability to not be solely focused on the Lithuanian pastoral tradition, because Lithuanian literature developed in a way out of the pastoral. Lithuanian language was from the countryside. It was not a terribly metropolitan language, and metropolitan experience was often ignored in Lithuanian literature. And in the 21st century, you find people turning towards different aspects of city life, as well as different cultural aspects. So let me give you a few examples. Pietinė Kronikas, or Southside Chronicle by Rimas Uzgiris, is one of my favorite 21st century novels. It deals with a neighborhood of Šiauliai, a sort of Soviet neighborhood that was rough in the 90s. It uses the local dialect, it uses slang from the 90s, Russian influenced slang, and at the same time it has quite a lot of humor. And it's a coming of age story of an individual in that time, as well as a coming of age of the nation, right? Where the individual's finding himself parallels the nation finding itself. Similarly, if you think of something like Strekaza by Judita Vaičiūnaitė, that is an urban novel in the 21st century that deals with multicultural aspects. It's got Russian in it, Polish. It has Jewish Lithuanian characters who speak Lithuanian with a Yiddish accent. And it's got a lot of dark humor and sarcasm. And it represents an ability of Lithuanian literature to start looking at different aspects of its past. And you can see this in certain historical novels as well. Say, for instance, Mano vardas Marytė, which was translated as In the Shadow of Wolves by Alvydas Šlepikas, looks at history, but not, say, the traditional Lithuanian history. It looks at the history of German children who ran from Prussia in the years after World War II to try to find food and sustenance in the Lithuanian countryside. That was an ignored history, and now you see this wonderful novel that deals with their experience. And similarly, you could say Kristina Sabaliauskaitė's novels, Silva Rerum, that series of novels, deals with the history of the Polish era in Vilnius. And again, this was largely ignored, right? The early nationalists, think of Maironis, for instance, were often focused on the medieval past, right? The great Lithuanian past of the Grand Duchy and Vytautas the Great, and in the wars to establish our identity and our independence. And for a long time, that complex Renaissance history where the upper classes were Polish speaking was often ignored in literature. And in the 21st century, you see people like Sabaliauskaitė and others turning back to this more complex and difficult period of our history. And so I think this is very enriching for Lithuanian culture. You even have, we recently read from my class, Bartosz Polonsky's novel Robčikas, or Robčik, which is written in the local tutejsze, or local Polish dialect, and deals with the very old local Polish community of Vilnius, and how they're living, and what their perspective is, and what their language is like. So these trends are quite interesting, and they represent an ability to look past that medieval period, to look past the countryside, and to try to embrace a much more complex and multifarious history of our region and our peoples. I came to translation while I was studying for my MFA in creative writing. This was after my career in philosophy, and I decided I wanted to, in a way, go all in, as they say, with poetry and dedicate myself to it. And I met Robert Haas, the American poet and translator. And when he found out I was Lithuanian, he said, "You should translate Lithuanian literature," because I had commented I had praised him for his work with Czesław Miłosz, who was a writer I really loved and admired. And so he, in a way, spurred me to take a look at translation as a possibility. And I had also been reading some translations of Tomas Venclova, who was also an important writer to me. Miłosz and Venclova were very significant, both partly because they were, of course, also emigres, and I could relate to that aspect, partly because they represented something broader in terms of Lithuanian identity for me. I didn't like the translations I was reading, and I decided, well, maybe Robert Haas is right. Maybe I should try. And so Tomas Venclova, who is not easy to translate, was my first serious attempt. And I remember at the same time I had picked up Paulius Nordvala's first book, which I really enjoyed. And that was, in a way, easier to translate. And so I was working on Nordvala and Venclova. And I was taking a graduate seminar then on translation theory and practice at Rutgers University and the New Brunswick campus. And that gave me a certain theoretical background. It showed me different perspectives and how people approach translation. And I got a translation of Venclova's published in the Massachusetts Review, which is a very elite journal and very hard to get into. And so I felt like I could do this, that you know, if I could get into there, then I should keep going. I was going to continue translating Tomas Venclova, but for the National Endowment of the Arts grant application, I needed to pick a single book. And Tomas Venclova already had multiple translators. And I needed a book that I could do all on my own for that application. And he suggested to translate Judita Vaičiūnaitė, who had been his friend when he was in Vilnius. And so I did, and I translated the selected poems of Judita Vaičiūnaitė. And what happened, I was already then living here in Vilnius, and people here decided that I was useful to them. And the Lithuanian Culture Institute, Marius Burokas, the poet and translator, got me involved in more translation projects. My translation career, you could say, took off from that. It turned out they needed me. And I was happy to be needed, and I enjoyed the work. Translation helped me read Lithuanian poetry more closely and intimately, and it also helped me develop my English stylistics and understanding of poetry. As many people will mention, the Lithuanian poetic tradition is very strong, and I think there have been many, many excellent poets through the 20th century into the 21st century. At this point in the 21st century, it's a little difficult for me to pick out one special trend. I find Lithuanian poetry to be branching in all kinds of directions and showing multiple modes of being, you could say. I myself was very much attracted to Tomas Venclova's cosmopolitan perspective, his ability to be both Lithuanian and a citizen of Western civilization. His ability to look beyond just sort of a more narrow Lithuanian perspective, while always dealing with Lithuania and its cultural history and its realia. That is, the things that are unique to this country, its architecture, its history, its particular moments in time. Now, Vaičiūnaitė also was a strong attraction to me because of how she articulated Lithuanian identity. She based it in the city of Vilnius, and she often drew, as I was mentioning when I talked about, say, Sabaliauskaitė, she drew often on the history of Vilnius during the Polish times. She would talk about Renaissance Vilnius, about the Radvilė family, the Pacas family appears in her poems, you get this sense of Vilnius embodying a differentiated, multiple sense of its past and a perspective that is broad and rather unique and interesting. And I think that for most people in the West, this is one of the things that is fascinating about Vilnius, that it embodies this multifarious identity and history. And people don't really understand this when they first approach Lithuania. And I think certain aspects of Lithuanian literature can really convey how complex and interesting our historical and cultural experience has been. And that historical and cultural experience is often encoded in the city itself. And you can find this, of course, in Ričardas Gavelis's works, as well as Kunčinas's, right, where they were some of the first novelists to really encode Vilnius as a character and as a place with its own personality. This is one of the great attractions for work such as this, and I think it helps people in the West understand what happened here. Because my sense is that Eastern Europe is often, for Westerners, just this sort of vague, complex zone that they don't understand, right? They have trouble understanding the difference between Latvians and Lithuanians, between Lithuanians and Poles, between Poles and Ukrainians, Ukrainians and Russians. It's all such a mix to them. And I think certain aspects of Lithuanian literature can help convey that complex history. Of course, it's also difficult, right? Because if you are not aware of our history, sometimes it takes a little bit of work as a reader to really engage with a literature that encompasses that history. There have been trends in Lithuanian poetry that have led to the more personal. Free verse has become more and more common, and the personal perspective, you could call it a confessional or semi-confessional perspective, has become more common. This could be a result of American influence. It's hard to say because sometimes you think that somebody's influenced by American, it turns out they haven't read much American poetry at all. So it might be also a kind of sign of the times. And the way I see that is that in the 20th century when Lithuania was occupied, speaking for the country through your poetry, speaking for the we or us, was a way to help maintain Lithuanian identity and to resist the pressures of Soviet ideology and Russification. Once independence happened, in a way that we or that us became less important, and people were scrambling to figure out how I could survive, right? What am I gonna do now? And so to some extent, the we and the us has broken apart. And this has been a trend that's been happening for over 100 years in Western civilization. We can see it in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, right, where there's a sort of yearning for an organic culture of the past that doesn't exist anymore, and that we live among fragments. And one response to these fragments is to focus on yourself, right, and to talk from your own experience, because what right do I have to talk for everybody, right? We all have a different experience now. And somehow, right, the goal seems to be to reach out from the self and to communicate with others, to find some means of touching with them, right? To find those bonds of sympathy, empathy, and understanding by writing a poetry from the self that is compelling and can draw others in and allow them to share in experience. However, I think a lot of this more personal poetry is still very Lithuanian. I don't think that there's really that much a threat of globalization or leveling, as some people seem to be worried about. If, for instance, you look at Giedrė Kazlauskaitė's poetry, who is often considered confessional or neo-confessional, it's still very much rooted in her Lithuanian experience, in her experience of life in Vilnius, and in the cultural realia that she encounters here. So it's hard to see that, you know, there's anything particularly American about it, except that she's willing to give her individuality an important place, right? And that also is part of the democratic tradition, right? That we are individuals, and yet at the same time, we are trying to be a community. And so I think a lot of these trends in Lithuanian poetry are not particularly American, but part of the way in which we grow as a democracy and assert our individuality while trying to find, at the same time, a sense of connection and community. There are, you know, certain works where you can look at them and say, oh, that seems American. Like I mentioned In the Shadow of Wolves, Mano vardas Marytė, by Alvydas Šlepikas. And I and my students thought that that was quite an American novel in its style, right? It's very cinematographic, right? It's very visual. He creates these really intense dramatic scenes with visuals and dialogue. And this is very compelling, right? It makes it a very intense and I would say even pleasurable read, although the pleasure is cut by the tragedies that it articulates. Nevertheless, in some ways, it is very American in that objectivity. However, was he influenced by America? I'm not sure, because he was originally writing a screenplay, right? And the novel shows the effects of the screenplay, I would say. And that might not have anything to do with America. It might just be the effect of film, right? And he wrote a filmic kind of novel. But to me, that's a very refreshing form of Lithuanian prose, because Lithuanian prose can often be a little bit, in my view, too self-obsessed with the interior monologues of some traumatized character. So I'm thinking of like Vytautas Vargalys from Vilnius Poker, where he's quite a brilliant character and has wonderful insights, but after 200 some odd pages of listening to him and being in his head, you really want to get away, because it's difficult to be in his head for so long. So Lithuanian prose has these different trends to it, and I'm not sure that it's particularly American. Undina Radzevičiūtė is another person who tends to write strong, dramatic scenes full of dialogue. She's one of the best dialogue writers I think we have, where she articulates characters and their relationships through dialogue rather than through interior monologues, as some of the other writers have done. One of the difficulties of translating Lithuanian literature is finding publishers in American Britain. It's really wonderful that we have the Vilnius Review here that has for a long time now taken on the role of presenting Lithuanian literature, contemporary Lithuanian literature, to the world. America and Great Britain do not publish a lot of translated literature, as we know, and they publish even less poetry. And when you are trying to find a publisher or trying to get work published in Britain or America, you are competing with the entire world. And Lithuanian literature is not well known. We have not produced a mega star. Tomas Venclova is reasonably well known. He lived in America, but there's still a huge amount of people in the literary world who have only just sort of vaguely heard of him. You know, he's not at the level of Miłosz or Brodsky, or even say Tomasz Šalamun from Slovenia. He became very trendy in American poetry circles. It's hard when you don't have a megastar, and so there's no real sense of, oh, we know Lithuanian literature, let's publish more of it. You're essentially just presenting a text competing with the whole rest of the world and trying to convince them that this text is as good or better than all those other texts that are being sent to them. And so it's difficult. It takes a lot of time also. And you have to keep sending things to journals, keep sending things to publishers, and this is one of my major difficulties is between teaching and writing poetry and translating, I run out of time and energy. I do get translations published, and I was happy 2 summers ago to have translations of Thomas Venclova appear in Asymptote, and then one of them was picked up by Poetry Daily and republished in their massive email list. Similarly, Kęstutis Navakas was published in the Paris Review and picked up by Poetry Daily as well. So there are these successes where you are able to position a Lithuanian author in some good publication. But it often takes quite a lot of trying, quite a lot of attempts to do so, and things have to be just right, and the editor has to be in the right mood, and so on, right? So it's not the easiest thing. And I've got, a manuscript of Giedrė Kazlauskaitė that's, been submitted, and I haven't heard a thing, for instance, right? You send it out, and it's like a black hole. Nobody responds to you. You have no idea if they've read it, if they're interested. They just don't answer, right? And so this is one of the frustrations of dealing with American Britain in the publishing worlds there. You're competing with so many people for very few spaces, and you often don't hear much of anything. So it of course would help if we could find some sort of trendy star who would suddenly break out, right? But so far that hasn't happened. So I mentioned my multiple careers, translator, professor, and poet, and as far as the poet goes, I felt accepted here as a poet very early. After I finished my MFA studies at Rutgers, I was invited, in fact, to the Druskininkai Poetic Fall Festival in 2012 as a guest. That was quite important to me because I wasn't established as a poet yet, and I hadn't published a book, and I had only published, a few handfuls of poems in journals, and so it was already a sign that Lithuanians were ready to accept me. And luckily, in that group of poems I sent, there was one that was very good, Švarkelis, the jacket, and that left a strong impression on people. So I in a way, I lucked out because I wasn't even that sure about the poems I was sending. How are people going to react? Are they really that good? They were all unpublished. They were rather new. And it turned out I had a hit with them, with one of them. That helped establish me as a person who really could write poetry, right? People accepted me as, okay, this guy can do it. And that felt very good for me, and Lithuanians accepted me. And they continued to translate my work, and I participated in the Poetry Spring readings. At first I would read in English, and then my translator would read in Lithuanian, and eventually I realized I should just read in Lithuanian. That is, read my translations myself. And I continued to work with the Druskininkai Poetic Fall as a translator and editor, and so I felt accepted here, and thematically my poems often deal with my experience as a child of Lithuanian emigres, a child of DPs, displaced persons. And in America, people don't always relate to that. Lithuania, in fleeing the Soviet Union, aren't the most trendy aspects of our experience in America. However, Lithuanians relate to this very well, and they relate to my poems that deal with my sense of being an emigre who's in between cultures and in between countries. because after all, there's many Lithuanians who have emigrated. Some come back, some of their children come back, and there's a strong sense here of people who understand that we can live in between cultures, right? And so I feel that I've been accepted as a poet here, and that's comforting and stimulating. At first, of course, I was an American poet, and I always felt that way. But in the last years, I have felt less and less so. And that's partly because I haven't had that many readings as a poet. What I've often done in America is present Lithuanian literature as well as my own poetry. And so I see myself there as a spokesman for Lithuanian poetry. And I have started to think of myself as a kind of Lithuanian poet who writes in English. Nevertheless, I'm different in that my poetry is also still partly rooted in my American self, which hasn't disappeared and probably never will. And so I am always, in a sense, torn as to where to position myself and exactly how. And I suppose that now I feel a little bit more as a Lithuanian poet writing in English than I ever did before. We'll see when my next book comes out.